The newly appointed Health and Social Services Ombudsman, Trevor Sparrow, appeared in front of the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee this week. The legislature created the position to help identify ways the state could improve child protection and foster care services. During the hearing, Sparrow fielded a question on other policy areas the office's Citizens Panel might consider.
Idaho has one of the highest rates of incarcerated women in the United States, and that translates into more kids in foster care. So I think that the Citizen Review Panel can be utilized for helping do some of that kind of research and how we can improve that and make legislative recommendations that way.
Joining me to discuss those high incarceration rates is Whitney Bryan of Investigate West. Whitney, you reported on this week. What did you find out about women's incarceration rates in Idaho?
Well, specifically in Idaho, we have the nation's highest rate of female incarceration. So taking into account the population of states across the country, Idaho incarcerates more women than any other state. And that's not new news. We've been at the top of that list since 2019. So we've held that position for a while. And even before that, Idaho has been high on that list for about the past 20 years now.
And that doesn't mean that Idaho has higher rates of crime, and certainly not violent crime.
Actually, it's the opposite. So we found that Idaho is much safer than most other states around the country. We actually have lower crime rates, especially in the violent crime area, but still incarcerating more women in our prisons.
So what's driving those rates?
It's largely about drug policy here in Idaho. So the majority of women in our prisons, about 60%, they're there for drug possession or in some cases distribution or trafficking charges. But that's the vast majority of women who we're locking up. It's for drug crimes. And they're staying there longer for those crimes than they would in other states as well. So those sentences are longer. We have the mandatory minimums, which means, there's not very much wiggle room for a judge to decide whether, a first-time offender, or maybe there's, something playing into a woman's decision to use drugs, trauma or something in her past. There's no room for those decisions to be made about lower sentences here in Idaho.
And as we heard from the Ombudsman, Trevor Sparrow, in that hearing, this has ripple effects on the community. A lot of these women who are incarcerated are also mothers.
Absolutely. Something in the range of 80% of the women in our prisons are mothers. I think that resonates across the country as well, but certainly is true here in Idaho, which of course means that, those children are going into the system. The likelihood that they're going to, a biological father is actually much lower than if dad gets incarcerated and a child is, more likely to go with mom. So in Idaho specifically, these women who have children are getting locked up, and then those kids are being taken into the system.
And this is coming at a time where, not just in Idaho, but across the nation, we're talking about drug policy. We're talking about very real concerns about fentanyl use and overdoses, and how that affects families in and of itself. What are some of the policy recommendations that you heard out of this report?
Well, that's very true, and I've heard a lot of that discussion about the concerns around drug use and trafficking and distribution specifically. But the report that I reported on has a lot of recommendations about treatment prior to drug use or in the early stages of drug use. So let's say a woman gets arrested for having drugs on her person, right? Rather than being taken straight to jail, going to the courts, getting sentenced for that possession, she could be taken to a treatment facility, a rehab type of facility. A lot of these women in Idaho have experienced really significant trauma in their lives that eventually drove them to their addiction. They were abused as children or adults, they experienced domestic violence, and so in order to cope and deal with that pain, they're turning to drugs. So pre-incarceration treatment is really a big recommendation that everyone I spoke to seems to be on board for.
And these numbers came from the Idaho Justice Project?
Yes, the Idaho Justice Project put this report together, though the numbers themselves are actually state and federal data, most of which were provided by DOC here in Idaho.
You also spoke to some lawmakers about the findings in this report. What did they say?
I did. I spoke to a couple lawmakers who are on the Judiciary Committee, so they're making recommendations about criminal justice policy, and they echoed those concerns about fentanyl especially, but drugs in general and use across the state of Idaho. So they told me, they're really struggling with their concerns about this high incarceration rate, especially of women, and the fallout that has on those women's children and the system here in Idaho. It's very expensive to incarcerate women and then take their kids into custody. But they're also very concerned about drug crimes, drug use, especially drug trafficking and distribution. So they're telling me, they're trying to weigh the options. How do we cut back on that and make that not okay here in Idaho? How do we stop some of that drug use, but also try to address this high incarceration rate?
And this comes already in the session. We've seen a bill to raise the minimum fine for marijuana possession to $300. So obviously drug use and abuse is at the top of these lawmakers' minds. Has the governor weighed in?
So the governor didn't speak directly to this report. I did reach out to him, but didn't get him immediately. What we have heard from him so far this year, though, and what I expect to hear more of, is similar to the lawmakers that I spoke to. He's very concerned about drug use and will continue to support, it sounds like, legislation like possibly that marijuana bill that you mentioned. He certainly supported the fentanyl minimum sentencing bill that we saw come through last year. He's definitely in favor of cutting back on drug use and trafficking, kind of some tough on crime policies there. However, he's also trying to weigh incarceration rates and the cost of putting especially these women in prison for drug crimes. So again, it's a tough balance, and I think we're going to see more from him on how he's thinking about those two things.
Right, certainly so many difficult societal issues to juggle there.
Right.
Whitney Bryan, Investigate West, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.